Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final year in our mini-series. Just give it another minute or two before we start. In the meantime, I'm going to share the source sheet. So if I could just have some thumbs up to confirm when you can see it. Fantastic. Okay, a minute.
All right, let's see what we can do here.
Okay, I think we're pretty much ready to kick off. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Much appreciated. And as you'll know, the topic of today's share is from Tisha B'Av to Tu B'Av. And we're really going to discuss that. We're going to discuss the period in which we find ourselves now. It kind of feels, in a certain sense, like, we're post the Euros. There was so much hype, so much buzz. And, we had this build up during the 3 weeks towards Tisha B'Av, just as we had with the Euros. And now we're not really sure what to do with ourselves. And we have this thing called Tu B'Av, which is going to fall this year on Shabbos. And for all intents and purposes, at least from a practical point of view, it's a little bit of a non-event. The only halachas we have associated with Tu B'Av are that we don't say Tachnan, and seeing as it falls on Shabbos, we wouldn't be saying Tachnan anyway. So what hopefully we'll be able to achieve today is to develop a greater understanding of what Tu B'Av stands for, the transition from Tisha B'Av to Tu B'Av, and hopefully we'll be able to take away some messages from this year. So I think without further ado, we'll jump into things. Okay, so looking at the source sheet. So let's begin by looking at a Mishnah at the end of Masechet Tanit, which really is going to be the backbone of our shir. So looking over here at source 1, and you can see that there's an English translation as well for those of you who prefer to follow in the English. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, lo hayomim tovim Yisrael k'chamisha sab'av v'chayom haKippurim. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said that there weren't Yomim Tovim, joyous days for the Jewish people, compared to the 15th of Av and to Yom Kippur. To say that Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, and Yom Kippur were the most joyous days in the Jewish calendar. And the Gemara elaborates on this Mishnah and says as follows: Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, lo hayomim tovim Yisrael k'chamisha sab'av v'chayom haKippurim. There were no joyous days on par with Chamisha Asab'av, Tu B'Av, and Yom Kippur in the Jewish calendar. Bishlam Yom HaKippurim. It's all very well, we can understand the grandeur of Yom Kippur. Mashum de Ispe Slicha Machila, because this was the day when there was forgiveness, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us for the sin of Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. Yom Shenisnu Bo Luchos HaAcharonos, and indeed this was the day when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the second set of tablets. So if you like, Yom Kippur really represents reconciliation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This was the day when, well, just prior to this day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wanted to destroy the Jewish people. However, through Moshe's prayers, Moshe's tefillahs and tachanunim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had mercy on us. He had rachmanas, reconciled with us, and gave us a second chance. He gave us the second luchos. So we can understand the joy, the simcha associated with Yom Kippur. But let us ask a few questions. And they're written out over here. Question number 1 is, what's the significance of Tu B'Av? Why is it the most joyful day alongside Yom Kippur? Question number 2 is, it's really an extension of the first question, which is, why is it more joyous than the Shalosh Regalim, than Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuos? Really an extension of question number 1. And question number 3 is a little bit of an inference from the Gemara, really from the Mishnah, which is, there seems to be a common thread, some commonality between Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur. They're compared, they're both considered the most joyous days of the year. And what is that common thread between them? So 3 questions, and we're going to answer them all at the end. So stay tuned in. To understand this, we really have to delve back into our history. And the first half of this year is really going to be exploring the historical narrative associated with Tu B'Av, delving in to the 6 events, joyous events, which occurred on the 15th of Av. And I've gone through them in chronological order. So the first one, as you can see in the source over here, I've entitled The Day When Those Decreed to Death in the Desert Stopped Dying. So just before we read the Gemara over here, I'd like to give a little bit of background to this. Okay, so over here, I appreciate that it's not so big. I'll make the screen a little bit bigger, but take it from me that this chart over here maps out our time in the desert, in the Midbar. And if you can see where the mouse is, you can see that this red box here is entitled Hamaraglim, and it's in Parsha Shlach Lecha. This was the time when we had Chet Meraglim, when the spies sinned and gave a negative portrayal. They spoke Lashon Hara against Eretz Yisrael. And the chart over here tells us that for that there were 38 years remaining, denoted by the 38, until eventually they were able to enter Eretz Yisrael, which is the end of the chart right here. Now, what happened immediately following Chet Meraglim after this sin? So the Torah itself tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed that no Jewish male aged 20 or above would enter Eretz Yisrael. All of them would die in the Midbar. In fact, it seems from the Gemara, according to most commentaries, and we're going to explore this in just a moment, it seems that those Jewish males, and there were 600,000 of them, would all die on Tisha B'Av, each year on the 9th of Av. And the reason for this was that the Chet Meraglim took place on the 8th of Av, and they cried when the Jewish people heard this news about how terrible Eretz Yisrael were. They cried, and they cried on the 9th of Av. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded that, listen, if you're going to cry a bechia shel chinam, a cry for no good reason, then I'm going to make you cry a cry for all of those years in the desert, namely that your Jewish males would die on the 9th of Av. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the Gemara over here. So the Gemara says, and please feel free to read along in the English. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Yom shekalu bo meisei midbar. This day, the day of Tu B'Av, was the day when those who had been decreed to die stopped dying. Da Amar, because Mar said, Ad shelo kalu meisei midbar, lo hayadiber in Moshe. The Torah tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe that he wouldn't converse directly with him. He wouldn't converse directly with Moshe until this decree that the Jews would die would be lifted. Shene'emar, as it says in the pasuk, "Vayhi kasher tamu kol alshei hamilchama lamus v'yedaber Hashem Elai Elai haya hadiber." It says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that only once those he had decreed to die, those 600,000 males would die, would he speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. But that's not what I'd like to focus on. Let's understand what actually happened here. So to understand that, I'd like to look at the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which goes in more detail, and the English is just below. And this is unbelievable. It's graphic, it's visceral, and it's actually painful. But we're gonna learn so much from it. Rabbi Avun said, Shabbato by HaChafira. On Tu B'Av, on the 15th of Av, the Chafira, the digging of the graves, and we'll explain what that is in just a moment, was cancelled. So Amar Rav Levi, because Rav Levi said, B'chol Erev Tisha B'Av, every eve of Tisha B'Av, Haya Moshe Rabbeinu motzi karas b'machne Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu would send out a message, an announcement in the Jewish camp. Ta'u lachbar, and he said, go out, leave the camp and dig. Hayotzim atzmam v'chofren kavaros. So what would they do? All of the Jewish males, any male who'd been aged 20 or above at the time of the Chet HaMeraglim would go out and he would dig his own grave. And each of them would lie, they would sleep in their grave. And then what happens? Of a shachar, and in the morning, Misha Nimtzachai, anyone who remained alive, anyone who woke up, Chazar Lamachana, they would return to the camp. Bahamesim Nisharu Bakivrehan. And those who had died during the night, they would remain, of course, in their graves. Amotenatzman B'choshana Chaserim, Tesvav Elef, B'Potrot. Every year, the Jewish people would find themselves losing. They would find that on that night, on Tisha B'Av night, they would lose 15,000 and a protvot. A protvot is a figure. Every single year, they would lose just over 15,000 Jews. Now, what's this protvot? To understand this, let's go down. I looked this up in the dictionary, in the Jasto dictionary, and they say as follows. They actually quote our Talmud Yerushalmi, and they say 15,789. I don't know if you can see that, it's quite small, but take it from me, it's 15,789 people who would die every year. And what's the reason for this? Well, the reason is, we said that there were 38 Tisha B'Avs from the time of Chet HaMeraglim, bearing in mind that they would only start dying from the year after the Chet. So from that year until they entered Eretz Yisrael, there were 38 Tisha B'Avs. So these 600,000 males died, you'd expect them to have died in a spaced out manner proportionally over the 38 years. Now, I have a calculator over here, and I've done 600,000 divided by 38. And if you do that, you get 15,789. And this is what the dictionary is telling us. So going back up here, we can translate the Yerushalmi. It says as follows. Let's just reread that one bit. We say, in the morning, whoever woke up, they would return to the camp. And those who had died would, of course, remain in their graves. Tesvav Elef B'Potrot, and every year they found that they lost 15,789 males. This was a tremendous tragedy. So what happens on the 38th year, the final year, when we have 15,789 males approximately who were still alive, those who had been aged 20 or more at the time of the Chet. So B'Shnat Lamed Chet, in the 38th year, Asu Kamin Hakal Hashanim. So they behaved like they had in every year. The surviving males went and they dug their own graves and they went to sleep in the graves. Amdu Kulon, Lo Meis Echad Mehen. The next morning, all of them arose. None of them had died. Amu, they were confused and they said, Ta'inu B'Cheshbon. We must have made a mistake with our calculation. It must be that tonight or last night was really Chet B'Av. Maybe it was the 8th of Av and not the 9th of Av. So what did they do? The next night they did the same thing. They went to sleep in those graves. And they said the same thing to themselves on the 11th, the 12th, 13th, and 14th of Av, because they kept waking up and they just didn't understand. They said, we must have made a mistake. Why aren't we dying? But Kivan Shekia to Ba'av. But once the 15th of Av came, and they were lying in their graves looking up at the moon, they saw a full moon. And once they saw a full moon, they realized it must be the 15th of the month. That's when we have a Milui Halavana, a Lavana Shalema, a full moon. And that was the moment when they realized that the decree had been lifted. So, although this was tragic, the fact that so many of these Jewish males passed away during those 37 years, we do see that there was a certain nechama, a certain consolation, in that on Tu B'Av, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lifted the decree and allowed those final 15,789 males to survive. Now, there is a question, and this I don't have an answer to, so if anyone has an answer, please feel free to unmute yourself. But the question is that the Torah itself in Parashas Shlach Lecha tells us that the only Jewish males who HaKadosh Baruch Hu permitted to enter Eretz Yisrael, of those Jewish males who had been aged 20 or above at the time of Chet HaMeraglim, were Yehoshua and Kalev. In which case, this piece of Chazal this Gemara is problematic because it seems that there were an additional, over 15,000 Jewish males. So exactly how this Gemara reconciles with the pure text of the Torah is somewhat problematic. If anyone has any thoughts, please unmute yourself. But Sof Kol Sof, at the end of the day, we clearly see that Tu B'Av has a certain simcha associated with it, because this was the day when they realized that the decree had been lifted and they would in fact survive to be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So this is number one. And let's move forward in history. The second joyous occasion, which took place on Tu B'Av, involved the Benot Tzlafchad, the daughters of Tzlafchad, just a few parashas ago, Matos Masei. Let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Yom shehusu shavatim lavo zeh bazeh. This was the day when the tribes were permitted to marry each other. Intertribal marriage was once again permitted. I'm actually going to leave the next bit of the Gemara. I'm just going to say it outside. But the backdrop to this is, we know that the Benot Tzlafchad approached Moshe Rabbeinu with a claim because their father, Tzlafchad, who was from the tribe of Manasseh, had passed away, leaving no sons. And the Torah law, just focusing on the Torah, leaving Chazal aside for a moment, is that if a father passes away with no sons, then rather than his assets, his estate going to his daughters, it actually goes to other male relatives, be it his brother, be it his father if he's still alive, or his uncle, but it doesn't go to the daughter. And the Benot Tzlafchad said, listen, our father Tzlafchad had died, he's left no sons, it's not fair. We should be entitled to this Yerusha, to this inheritance. Moshe Rabbeinu says, listen, that's a great point. You consult with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem says they're right. Give them the nachala, give them the portion of their father. At which point, the men of the tribe of Manasseh approached Moshe and they said, Moshe, listen, this is very nice, but the portion of Manasseh now lies at risk. Because let's say that these ladies, these daughters of Tzlafchad, go ahead and get married, and they marry men from other tribes, be it Binyamin or Yehuda or whoever. And let's say they then pass away. Who will inherit that piece of land? Well, presumably it will be their sons. To say this portion of land, which initially belonged to our tribe, to Manasseh, will go to the tribe of Binyamin or to the tribe of Yehuda or whichever tribe they marry into. In which case, the portion of Manasseh will be distilled. And they said, we can't have that. Moshe says, that's a good point. So he went to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, yes, I'm going to make a gezerah that if any daughter inherits an estate from her father by virtue of her father not having sons, then it's forbidden, it's usher for her to marry a male from another tribe. Now, this was extremely restrictive. This meant that these ladies had to marry within their tribe. And the Gemara over here tells us that this was the day, Yom Shehutru Shvatim Lavo Zeh Bazeh. This was the day when the Rabbanon decided to lift this decree. They decided, and this actually took place when they entered Eretz Yisrael, and Yeshua split up the land. Yeshua said, we're going to lift this decree, and any lady who inherits from her father by virtue of her father not having any sons will once again be able to marry into other tribes. So this was a tremendously joyous day for these ladies, and indeed for all of Klal Yisrael. It encouraged unity and harmony amongst the tribes, and this is also one of the reasons why Tu B'Av has this association with marriage, because this is when they could marry many more people. This is the second reason. So the first one is people stopped dying. The second one is these ladies could once again marry into other tribes. The third reason involved Pelegesh Begiva. So the background to this is a horrific story which occurred towards the end of Shoftim. Towards the end of Sefer Shoftim, in fact, in the last 3 parakim, the Bnei Yisrael was effectively in anarchy. I have over here in the highlights, it says, Bayamim Haim, in those days, Ein melech b'Yisrael, there was no king. We know that there were judges, but there was no single leader of the Jewish people. Ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh. Each man did as he pleased. Now we may take this and interpret it to mean that we lived in an idyllic society where no governing body was needed because people were mentioned, people behaved in a good way. But the truth is the opposite. There was absolute anarchy and lawlessness. To the extent that Shoftim concludes with perhaps the most horrific anecdote in all of Tanakh, and this is known as Pelegesh Begiva. What was Pelegesh Begiva? Pelegesh Begiva involved a man from the tribe of Levi, and he had a Pelegesh, he had a concubine. This man from the tribe of Levi was traveling in a town called Giva, which was in the tribal portion of Binyamin. And it got late at night, and an individual from Binyamin approached him, and he said, listen, don't stay in the town square. Don't sleep in the open because it's dangerous. Come and stay in my house. So this gentleman goes to his house. He lodges in the home. He takes the Pelegesh, his concubine, inside. And then Binyaminites approach the man, their host, and says, who's this man? Who's this man who you're hosting? Send him out to us. We're not happy with this. And the host tries to appease his fellow Binyaminites, but to no avail, to the extent. And the only way that eventually he manages to appease his fellow Binyaminites is through encouraging, or really it wasn't through encouragement. This man from Levi sent out his concubine to the open. He wasn't a paragon of righteousness. He was quite a wicked person. He sent out his concubine to capture their attention. And these Binyaminites, they accosted this concubine and, excuse my language, but they gang raped her. And you can just imagine the atrocities. It was a terrible, horrific event. The next morning, this man from Levi left the home, and he found her on the ground, dead. She was so traumatized, both physically and emotionally, from what had happened, that she died. And he was furious with the tribes of Binyamin. So he severed her body into 12 sections to send to the other 12 tribes, bearing in mind that Manasseh and Ephraim had been split into two, seeing as Levi didn't inherit in the land. And he sent a piece of her body to each of the tribes to get their attention and demanded that they do something to try the culprits from Binyamin. And they did. They formed a committee. They approached Binyamin and they demanded that they extradite the culprits to be tried, but Binyamin refused. Binyamin refused. And to this, the other tribes waged war against Binyamin, and they decimated them. Not just the men, but the women and children too. In fact, I'm just going to go down a little bit. It seems that only 600 males from Binyamin survived. It says in the pasuk, I'm just going to read the English over here. It says, but 600 men turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. They remained at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. And following that, the other tribes made a vow. They took the following vow, and they said, now the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mitzvah, and they said, none of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjaminite. What's the idea? The other tribes wanted nothing to do with Binyamin. And so they took a shavua, a vow, that they wouldn't give any of their daughters to be married to Binyamin. Now, this was tragic, not just because a tribe was almost totally decimated, but we know that for HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shekhinah, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's godly presence to rest in the land in its fullest form, we require a wholesomeness within the Jewish people. We require all the 12 tribes. And so this effectively pushing Binyamin into extinction would have terrible effects, not just, it didn't just have terrible effects on a practical level, killing all of those people, but on a spiritual level too. And it was on this day, the Gemara tells us, on Tu B'Av, that this ban from people being able to marry into the tribe of Binyamin was lifted. And in so doing, the tribe of Binyamin was able to survive. So let's just read this quickly in the Gemara, and you can see the English below. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Yosef said in the name of Rav Nachman, Yom Shehutar Shevet Binyamin Lavo Bakahal. This was the day when the tribe of Binyamin were once again allowed to enter into the congregation. And in so doing, the 12 tribes were reinstated. So this was a tremendously joyous day. Following this tragedy, at least there was something good, something positive in the end. And this is, again, a reason why Tu B'Av is associated with marriage, because this was a day they could once again marry into the other tribes. Let's see the fourth reason, and we've got just 3 more, and then we're going to really tie it together and answer all of our questions, and it's going to be magical. So the fourth reason is they were once again able to revisit Yerushalayim. What's the backdrop to this? To understand this, we need to, again, see a little bit of history. The history is as follows. Following Shlomo HaMelech's death, his kingdom was split into 2 kingdoms. We have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. As you can see in this illustration, the green is, of course, the northern kingdom, which was known as Malchus Yisrael. And the south, the orange, is Malchus Yehuda. Malchus Yehuda was governed by the descendants of David HaMelech. It was Malchus based David and the descendants of Shlomo. However, those who weren't happy with the descendants of Shlomo ruling, they broke away, the 10 tribes broke away, and they formed Malchus Yisrael up top. And the first king of Malchus Yisrael in the northern kingdom was a Russia. And you can see this over here. I appreciate it's a bit small, to tell me to make it bigger. But the first king in the northern kingdom was Yerovam, or Jeroboam, the first, Yerovam ben Nevat, and he was a Rasha Marusha. He was an evil king. And he was also a paranoid king. So much so that he forbade the Jews from his constituency from passing over the border, this border right here, and visiting the Beis HaMikdash, visiting Yerushalayim. The reason being, he felt that they may defer their alliance from his kingdom to the southern kingdom once they recognized the grandeur and the beauty associated with the Beis HaMikdash and Yerushalayim. This really was kind of, when I was learning about this, it reminded me of, North Korea and South Korea. It really does sound like that. You see these videos of dissidents running, fleeing from North Korea to South Korea, and that's really what happens here. He forbade the people from his kingdom going down to Jerusalem. And how did he do this? So to understand how he did this, let's have a look, or just say one more thing. Aside from forbidding them from visiting the southern kingdom, he also set up idols. He set up golden calves in his constituency in the northern kingdom, which the Jews would be able to worship at in place of worshipping at the Beis HaMikdash. Anyway, so how did he prevent the Jewish people from going down? The Gemara tells us, Ulla Amar, Ulla said, Yom Shebita Hoshea ben Elah prosdaos. This was the day when Hoshea ben Elah, who was the last king in the northern kingdom, when he cancelled and got rid of the sentry guards. Who were these sentry guards? Shehoshev Yeravam ben Nevat al Hadrachim. Yeravam ben Nevat stationed guards along the border between the northern and the southern kingdom, ensuring that none of the Jews fled from the northern to the southern kingdom. And the final king of the northern kingdom, Hoshea ben Elah, if we just go down to our timeline over here, you can see that we have the northern kings who are in red, and Hoshea is the final one. So Hoshea ben Elah, approximately 300 years after Yerovam came to power, got rid of these guards. And for that, and he also destroyed the golden calves. And for that reason, it was a great day of Simcha, because the Jews could once again visit the Beis HaMikdash. And secondly, the Avodah Zarah, which Yerovam had instated, was destroyed. These golden calves were removed. Let's see the fifth joyous event which occurred on this day. Haruge Beitar were buried. Haruge Beitar, the dead of Beitar, were finally allowed to be buried. What is Beitar? Beitar is not the same as Beitar in Yerushalayim today. Beitar, the Beitar from the times of Tanakh is, they think it's some Arab village. I've got it written down somewhere, but they think it's some sort of Arab village nearby to where Beitar Illit is today, but it's not the same as what we refer to as Beitar in modern Jewish history. But what happened at Beitar? Well, we know that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed approximately in the year 70. 65 years following the destruction, the second Beis HaMikdash. 65 years following the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash by the Romans, there was a great Jewish military leader called, I remember his full name, he was called Shimon ben Koziba, and he was known by many as Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. In fact, he was given this name by none other than Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva had great faith in Shimon ben Koziba. He actually thought that he was the Mashiach himself. Incredible. And that's a whole other share in and of itself. But 65 years after the destruction of the Second Beis Hamikdash, Bar Kokhba waged a revolt against the Romans, and he was initially extremely successful. In fact, history tells us that he was able to regain dominion over 900 towns from the Romans. However, Hadrian, the Roman general, was very upset, and he retaliated with overwhelming force and brutality. And this took place at the revolt in Beitar. And he killed literally hundreds of thousands of Jews. And this is incredibly visceral. But the Medrash in Eicha Rabbah tells us that there was so much blood from the Jewish people who had been killed and from their horses that the blood literally flowed into the Mediterranean. We can't even conceptualize this. The Medrash also tells us that the Romans used the Jewish blood to fertilize their gardens and their fields for years. That's, the proportion, the sheer magnitude of this tragedy. Literally hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. But it wasn't just that. Hadrian was evil, and he wanted to bang the nail in the coffin. And the way he did this was through forbidding the surviving Jews from burying their dead for 3 years and a week. For 3 years and a week, you can imagine, one of the surviving Jews would be walking around. They would walk to the shop, they would walk to Dublin, they would walk wherever it was in Beitar, and they would see their mother, they would see their child, they would see their brother, their sister, their father lying dead before them. And there's nothing they could do. This is torture, and this sort of, it's not for me to say, but we've just had Tisha Beav, and maybe some of us saw videos associated, images from the Holocaust, and this really reminds us of the Holocaust. And in a certain sense, this was even more painful. They couldn't bury their dead. They saw them every day. And the Gemara tells us, I'm going to read inside now, Rav Masna Amar, Rav Masna said, Yom Shenisnu Haraga Beit HaLikvura, that Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, was the day when finally the Jews were allowed to bury their dead. And what was the miracle? It wasn't just that they were allowed to bury their dead, it was more. The Gemara tells us elsewhere, and the Mefarshim explain on this Gemara, that the Jews who had died, miraculously, their bodies had not decomposed one iota. They had the freshness of someone who had died just yesterday, just the day before. And in that sense, although the Jews had undergone this terrible tragedy of Churban Beitar, there was a certain nachama, a certain consolation that they were able to bury their dead with covered, with respect, with their dead, not having decomposed. So this is the fifth joyous event. And I'm now going to go on to the sixth, and then we're really going to tie it together. The conclusion of the wood cutting season. So, following the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash by the Babylonians, there was a tremendous shortage of wood. The reason being that the Babylonians, and later the Romans as well, destroyed whole forests. In fact, even today in Israel, we know that there aren't many forests. And the reason for that is partially still due to the destruction enacted by the Babylonians and the Romans. Now, this meant that wood was in extremely short supply, and wood was, of course, needed for the korbanos. And so it was very hard to find the wood. And what they'd do is they would meticulously find wood every year, and they would cut it, and they just pray that they had enough. And the Gemara over here tells us that the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, was the day when they stopped cutting the wood. This was the end of the wood cutting season. And the Gemara says, I'm going to read it quickly, Rabba Rav Yosef, Rabbi and Rav Yosef, the Amos Rabbi, who both of them said, Yom Shepasku Melichos Eitzim Lema'aracha. This was the day, Tu B'Av was the day when they stopped cutting wood for the Ma'aracha, for the arrangement of wood required for the Karbanis in the base of the Mikdash, Desanya, because it taught in a Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Haggadah Omer, Mechamisha Asa B'Av Ve'elach, Tashas Kocha Shel Chama. From the 15th of Av onwards, the strength of the sun dissipated. Below Hayukotim Eitzim Lema'aracha, Lefi She'enan Yeveshim, and therefore they stopped cutting wood for the Karbanis because the wood wasn't dry enough. Now, what really happening over here is that in the summer, when the sun shines down with full force, the wood would dry out. There wouldn't be moisture, and for that reason, there wouldn't be wormwood. There won't be worms in the wood, so the wood would be deemed respectable enough, fitting to be used for the Karbanis. However, from the 15th of Av onwards, when summer would be over, that's what they understood, the sun wouldn't be powerful enough, and the wood would be moist, and there'd be worms, and so they were no longer able to use it for the Beis HaMikdash. And the reason why this was a simcha was really twofold. Firstly, they celebrated that they'd been able to cut down enough wood to last them for the entire winter. And secondly, they celebrated that they were able to stop cutting down this precious wood and leave the trees to rejuvenate, to regrow. And in so doing, they were able to ensure the continued fertility of Eretz Yisrael. So just to quickly recap, there were 6 joyous events which occurred on Tu B'Av. Firstly, those who had been decreed to die, the final year's worth of people, over 15,000 people, they survived, and this became clear to us on Tu B'Av. Secondly, we say that that ladies who inherited from their fathers by virtue of their fathers having no male offsprings, they were once again able to marry into other tribes. Thirdly, Binyamin were once again able to enter the Bnei Yisrael and marry into the other tribes. Fourthly, Hoshea ben Elah, the final king of the northern kingdom, removed the sentry guards and crucially destroyed the golden calves in the northern kingdom, removing the Avodah Zarah, and once again allowed the Jews to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Fifth, Rav Masna tells us this was the day that those who had been killed in Beitar were finally able to be buried, and finally the wood stopped. So this was the day when we could celebrate the fertility of the land. Now, Rav Breitowitz of Or Sameach explains that there are 5 events which the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us occurred on Tisha B'Av. And if we explore them, we're just going to touch upon them, we can actually see a parallel between these events and the events of Tu B'Av. And this is going to be the lesson. This is really the start of the conclusion. The Mishnah tells us as follows, and please follow along. B'Tisha B'Av nigzar ala v'seinu shelo yikansu la'aretz. On Tisha B'Av, there was a gezerah, a decree on our forefathers that they were not able to enter the land. This is referring to the 600,000 males who would die. On Tisha B'Av, they wouldn't be able to enter the land. That's one. The Charav Habayis Baroshona, the first Beis HaMikdash, the first temple would be destroyed, was destroyed. Ubashniya, the second temple was destroyed. The Nilkadar Beitar, and Beitar, this horrendous decimation enacted by Hadrian, took place on Tisha B'Av. And finally, fifth, V'nechusha Ha'ir. This refers to the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, or just after, when the Romans plowed Yerushalayim with salt and the area around Yerushalayim to scupper, to absolutely obliterate the fertility of the lands. Nothing can grow when there's salt there. These are the 5 tragedies. And there are actually parallels between the joyous events which occurred on Tu B'Av and these 5 events. So let's run this through. What was the first tragedy of Tisha B'Av? These 600,000 males were doomed to die and unable to enter the land. And on Tu B'Av, there was a partial mitigation, namely the final batch of over 15,000 people survived and they were able to enter the land. Secondly, the second tragedy was that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The Gemara tells us, as we saw in the first year, that there were 3 reasons why the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Firstly, Gilui Arayos, promiscuous, inappropriate sexual behavior. Secondly, avodah zarah, idolatry. And finally, shvichas dam, and bloodshed. And if we read through the Nevi'im, Yirmiyahu, Yeshaya, the Nevi'im, the prophets who deal with this period in time, it's very clear that the most prevalent of all of these sins was by far and away avodah zarah, idolatry. And this was countered by the fourth joyous event, which took place on Tu B'Av, namely Hoshea ben Elah, the final king, removing these golden calves, removing the avodah zarah, and once again allowing the Jews to serve, to go and visit the Beis Hamikdash. The third tragedy of Tisha B'Av was the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. This was destroyed due to sinas chinam, due to chalukah, due to pirud, due to fragmentation, division, people being in their own orbit, their own clique, and not feeling part of the klal, of the single unit of the Jewish people. And this was countered by two events on Tu B'Av, namely these daughters, the Benot Tzlachad, and all of those daughters who inherited from their fathers. They were once again able to marry into the other tribes, so that this inter-tribe harmony and inclusiveness. And secondly, the people from Binyamin were once again able to marry into the other tribes. So this counters sinas chinam. People were no longer in their own tribes, in their own orbit, but rather we are once again free to intermingle, to spread ourselves amongst the entirety of Klal Yisrael. The fourth tragedy was Beitel was destroyed. And of course, the partial nechama, the partial consolation was that on Tu B'Av we were finally able to bury the dead. And the fifth tragedy was that Yerushalayim was plowed over with salt and the fertility was obliterated. And the mitigation for this was the final event which took place on Tu B'Av, which was when the Jewish people no longer had to cut the wood, and in so doing they allowed the trees to regrow and rejuvenate. And in so doing ensured the fertility of the land. So we can begin to see that there's a relationship between Tisha B'Av and Tu B'Av. Tisha B'Av represents tragedy, as Dan explored last week. Tu B'Av represents hope, but it doesn't just represent hope in isolation. It represents hope following tragedy. All of the joyous events which occurred on Tu B'Av mitigate, they remedy, they rectify partially the tragedies of Tu B'Av. There's a beautiful analogy which we can draw. After a relative passes away, we sit Shiva. There are 7 days of Shiva, and the seventh day, although not a day, the seventh day is a day when we only sit for a very short time, for about an hour or so, and then we get up. We get up, that's what we say, we get up from Shiva. But although it's a day which we only sit for about an hour or so, it's still very much part of the Shiva. And this really mirrors the transition from Tisha B'Av to Tu B'Av, because Tisha B'Av was the first day of Shiva, the day of tragedy. Then we have the 10th of Av, the second day of Shiva. We have the 11th of Av, the third day. The 12th of Av, the fourth day. The 13th of Av, the fifth day. The 14th of Av is the sixth day. And then we have the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av. This is the seventh day of Shiva. This is the day when we get up. There's a minhag that after people finish sitting Shiva on the seventh day, they quite literally get up and walk around the block. And this represents exactly what Tu B'Av is about. It's the fact that either we can continue sitting and we can surrender ourselves to the pain and the grief of having lost someone to whom we felt so close. But if we do that, then we're actually paralyzing ourselves. We're paralyzing ourselves and we're blocking ourselves from being able to move forward. Tu B'Av is the getting up from Shiva. Tu B'Av is us recognizing that we have undergone tragedy. We've all undergone pain in our own lives, and this applies to us just as much as it did to them in the time of these tragedies. And we have to take those tragedies, but we have to move forward. But the truth is that it's not just about moving forward from tragedy. It's actually deeper than that. It's about taking the tragedies and using the internal feelings which the tragedies generate within us to power an invigorated growth going forward. What do we mean? To explain this, I'd like to go through and this really is the last piece, I'd like to go through something which Rav Gershon Overlands of Chabad Hendon actually showed me yesterday and learnt with me. So this is Bezuchatim. And this is an essay from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'm not going to read through all of it. I'm going to say most of it outside. But I'd just like to read a few lines. Firstly, outside, let's recap our 3 questions. The first question was, why is it that Tu B'Av is the most joyful of all Yom Tovim, on par with Yom Kippur? Secondly, an extension, why is it even more joyful than the Shalosh Regalim? And finally, what's the common thread between Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, such that a parallel was drawn between them in the Mishnah? And hopefully with this we can actually answer, with this piece in the Rebbe, we can answer the questions. The Rebbe explains, I'm going to say it mainly outside and read when I feel it's relevant. The Rebbe explains that Tu B'Av is the 15th of Av. The 15th of the month, we know, is the day when we have the full moon, a whole moon. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that the Midrashim explain that the Jewish people are Meduma. The Jewish people are compared to the moon. The Jewish people are compared to the moon, and this is something we see throughout the Torah Sheba'al Peh. We are compared to the moon. And as such, the fullness of the 15th day of the month, the full moon, can also in a sense represent the shlemus, the fullness of the Jewish people. What does this actually mean though? And we also have to ask ourselves that Pesach takes place on the 15th of the month as well, on the 15th of Nisan. Similarly, Sukkot takes place on the 15th of Tishrei. So we can begin to get an understanding, an idea that Tu B'Av is special. It is special. It does represent a certain wholesomeness of the Jewish people. But why isn't that true also for Sukkot and Pesach? So with that, I'd like to read just a few words from the Rebbe. And I apologize that it's not translated, but I'll translate as I go. So he says, and let's go from where the mouse is. He's quoting the Rebbe Rashab, one of the earlier Rebbes. He says, although on every 15th of the month there's a certain mili halavana, the moon is full. Mikol makom, nevertheless, godel hama'ala de mili halavana hu hamiliwi shel acharei hachisaron. He says the true greatness, the true godless, the true grandeur of the fullness of the moon is when it becomes full. Because something which becomes whole, which becomes full after having been lacking, is greater, it's more exalted than something which is inherently full. Kiyadua, he's going to explain, Kiyadua haklab aliyas v'yeridas, as we understand this general idea in respect to growing and descending. To ha'aliyah shla'acharei hayerida, hi aliyah lemala yota mahadarga shlefnei hayerida. He says, whenever we experience an aliyah shla'acharei hayerida, whenever we grow, and that growth follows a time when we were sort of down, at times when things were hard, then the growth which we experience, the loftiness which we experience, is actually far more admirable and far more potent than when the growth is always there, when we always find ourselves on a high level. And in that sense, he explains that so too with the moon. The greatness of the 15th of the month, the wholesomeness of the moon, is that the moon becomes whole after having been lacking. And he goes on to explain, this is the uniqueness of Tu B'Av. So let's just read a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to read from where the mouse is. Second last line of the first image. Ha'aliyah de Tu B'Av, the growth of Tu B'Av, represented by the wholesomeness of the moon. Shela acharei hayirida de Tish B'Av, which follows the descent, the tragedy and hardship of the 9th of Av, just a week earlier. Hi aliyah gedola b'yota. This is a greater sense of aliyah, a greater sense of growth, because it follows hardship. And this is what we mean when we say that there were no Yom Tov, no days as joyous to us on par with the 15th, Shehu Yom Tov Gadol Yoter, Gama Hayamim Tovim to Pesach v'Sukkos. It's even greater than the days of Pesach and Sukkos. Af Shegam Yamim Tovim Ela Heim Tu B'Av B'Chodesh. Even though these days also fall on the 15th of the month, representing a certain perfection and wholesomeness. Why is it that Tu B'Av was greater? Ki Haliyah de Tu B'Nisan Pesach, because the Aliyah on the 15th of Nisan, Pesach, even though it did follow a hardship, it followed the Galus, the exile from Mitzrayim. He says, at the time when the Jews left, they were actually on an exceptionally high level. Immediately beforehand, they weren't. But at the time when they left, they were actually on a very high level. Chazal tell us that at the time when they left, they were like a cotton chanelad. They were like a newborn baby. They were like a completely new people, completely purified. They transcended the 49 levels of Tumah to reach an exceptionally high level. But this took place before the 15th of Nisan. And for that reason, the spiritual wholesomeness, which is felt and represented by the wholesomeness on the moon of the 15th of Nisan, wasn't immediately following a chesaron, a certain lacking. It kind of was, but the growth didn't take place on the 15th of Nisan itself. It took place beforehand. And we'll tie this together in a moment. And for this reason, the growth represented by the 15th of Nisan on Pesach wasn't an exact hemshech, continuation from the lowliness which was before them. The Gam Haliyah, the Tu B'Tishrei, and the growth on the 15th of Tishrei Sukkos, even though it did follow the lowliness of Cheta Egel, which was just before Yom Kippur, ultimately, when did the growth take place? It took place on Yom Kippur. That's when HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us, and that's the day when we transcended ourselves and we received the second Luchos. It was on Yom Kippur, but on the 15th of Tishrei itself, we didn't experience the Aliyah. Rather, it was just revealed to us the joy which followed what we had achieved and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gifted us. Yom Kippur was felt on Sukkot, but ultimately the Aliyah itself didn't take place on Sukkot. As opposed to the growth which followed the Yerida, the lowliness and the tragedies at the beginning of Av on Tisha B'Av, Shahaliya Atzmahi B'Tu B'Av, because the actual ascent itself took place on Tu B'Av. L'chein hayom tov d'chamisha B'Av Yota Mahayom tov d'Pesach v'Sukkos. This is the reason that it was more exalted than Pesach and Sukkos. And with this, I'm going to elaborate on this. With this, we can answer our questions. We said before that Tu B'Av follows Tisha B'Av for a reason. It represents us repairing things, us being metakein, us remedying tragedy, and sometimes remedying faults within ourselves. Unlike the other Shalosh Regalim, Shavuos is a bit of a different story. Unlike the other Shalosh Regalim, which did take place on the 15th, and they do represent a certain wholesomeness of the Jewish people represented by the moon. Unlike them, when the Aliyah actually took place before the festival, and Tu B'Av, the 15th of the month, is really the time when the Aliyah, the wholesomeness, was actually experienced and felt. Tu B'Av was unique. Tu B'Av was the day when the Aliyah actually took place. To put this into context, Tu B'Av was the day when we were able to reflect on the tragedies of Tisha B'Av. And we were able to take the internal messages, to take the strength which the tragedies had gifted us, and we were able to incorporate those into our lives. It all took place on Tu B'Av. Tu B'Av is the day of Aliyah itself. And this is also the reason why Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur are compared, because Yom Kippur is the day when we actually underwent the Aliyah. It's the day when we received the Luchos. And with this in mind, I'm just going to summarize this point. This really is the end of the shir. With this in mind, we can begin to appreciate Tu B'Av. Tu B'Av is us getting up from Shiva. It's a time when we take pain, we take tragedy, and those of us, myself included, who have sat Shiva know the pain. It never leaves us. The grief is always there. But ultimately, we recognize that we're able to grow so much stronger from that pain if we're able to move forward, if we're able to, take it and help people with it and become exceptional people. Please God. This is also it's special to think about, because if we just look at more recent Jewish history and we look at Hakamas Medinas Yisrael, the declaration of the Jewish state in 1948, Medinas Yisrael was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. There were incredible people who somehow battled through the Holocaust with tremendous fortitude, conviction, and strength of mind, were able to drive forth the building of Medinas Yisrael. That's how it came about. It came about through the Holocaust. We took tragedy, we took the Tisha B'Av, and we channeled that tragedy through the lens of optimism. And eventually, we had Israel, Medinas Yisrael. And that's what Tu B'Av is. It's looking at things through the lens of optimism. And this really is the Jewish story. So with that in mind, Be'ez Hashem, we can look back on Tisha B'Av and indeed any hardships which we've undergone, especially in coming on to a year and a half now. And Be'ez Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give us the koach, the strength to channel those hardships through the lens of positivity and optimism, to continue the Jewish story, and in so doing, bring the Geula. I do have a story to share. We have 3 minutes left. I'm just going to share it because it's opportune, and then open up for questions. It's quite an amazing story. You'll see why I'm sharing it. We've spoken about the Holocaust a little bit, and this story really blew my mind. In 2018, there was a Jewish lady traveling on a bus in Antwerp, a frum lady, notably Jewish. And there was a non-Jewish lady called Maya. This non-Jewish lady got on the bus. Now, it's important to note that she didn't normally take this route back from work, but there was construction work, and in short, she wasn't able to take her normal route, so she got on the bus. She noticed this Jewish lady, and she approached her and says, "Listen, are you Jewish?" She said, "I am." She said, "Do you read Hebrew?" She said, "I do." And this non-Jewish lady removed a kos, a becher, a cup, from her bag, which had Hebrew writing. And she said, "Would you mind translating this?" And she said, "Sure." She read the cup, and the cup said that this is presented to Menashe Tzvi ben Michael Shalom Winkler, in whatever year it was, on the occasion of his bar mitzvah. Menashe Tzvi, the son of Michael Shalom Winkler. And at this point, this Jewish lady had one of those moments, because she recognized this name. Her father had emigrated from Denmark to Belgium. And this Menashe Tzvi was actually her father's uncle. Can we just mute? Okay, I'm going to continue. This Menashe Tzvi Winkler was actually her father's uncle, and he was still alive. He was living in Lakewood, aged 99 at the time. And she said to this lady, "What's going on? Like, how did you get hold of this?" And she said, "Well, I have a friend, and this friend's father was a fisherman. He was a Danish fisherman during the war, and he saved Jews. And he ferried them across from Denmark to, I think, Sweden, to a safe country. And there was a newly married man with his wife, and he had this cup, and he gave it to my friend's father as a thank you. Anyway, my friend recently lost his father, and he was clearing it out, and he felt kind of bad because he realized that this wasn't really his father's cup. This belonged to this man. And so he said, "Listen, Maya, I know you live in Antwerp. there are many Jews. Take the cup, translate the inscription, and maybe you'll be able to find some relatives of this person. And so he gave it to me. Sorry, just hang on a second. He said, maybe you'll be able to find this person. And so sure enough, Maya took the cup, and she found this lady in Antwerp. And this lady in Antwerp contacted her father's uncle, who was still alive, aged 99, and gave it back to him. And just 2 weeks later, he used this cup to make Sheva Brachas under the chuppah for his grandson, who was named Michael Sholem Winkler, named after Menashe Tzvi's father. This took place just 3 years ago. And the reason I'm sharing this is, firstly, it's associated with what we've seen, this idea of taking tragedy and channeling it into positivity. But it's also because Menashe Tzvi Winkler actually passed away aged 103 just yesterday. And so this shir should be Leilu Nishmaso, and Be'ez Hashem will be able to internalize the lessons of Tu B'Av into our own lives, and in so doing, bring the Geula. That's the end of the shir. If anyone has questions, then please feel free to unmute yourself. And a big thank you to everyone for attending.
Josh, can I ask a